Hello and welcome. My name is Brianna McWilliam, and I am a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist. I am also someone who likes to help individuals struggling with insecure attachment in their relationships go from feeling kind of stuck and lost and or fearful in their partnerships to being much more what I call self-sovereign in their partnerships, so they can start having the soul-shaking, passionate relationships that they want. And I approach this from the perspective of psychospiritual interventions with creative arts therapies practices through the framework of attachment theory. And I am excited to be here with the fabulous Kyle Benson. And Kyle, I'm just going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Kyle Benson. I am an intentionally intimate relationship coach. I mostly help individuals with attachment anxiety and even more so couples. I really love doing couples work. That's my passion, because seeing people who feel really misunderstood, disconnected, there's literally a chasm of issues or problems between them, and helping them work on how to navigate that and reconnect and actually build a much stronger relationship is probably the most rewarding thing I get to do. And so I'll talk a lot about that kind of probably today as we explore.
Mm-hmm. And so just as a recap, this is the final video in a 4-part video series Kyle and I have been sharing, in which we explored some common questions posed by our respective audiences. So just as a recap, in our first video, we talked about how do I express my needs in a relationship. In the second video, we talked about how do I spice up the romance in the relationship. In our last video, we talked about what's the difference between love and attachment. And today we were talking about diving into a more experiential process to share with everyone. And Kyle, how does that sound to you?
Sounds great. And I think our goal with this experiential process is we're going to be doing it. Brianna and I are going to be doing it. And we hope that if you are in a safe space for you to do this with us, you can join us, and also get the reward of getting the experience. And I think from an attachment perspective or a relational perspective, we get a lot of insight into how we could behave differently, but change happens experientially. And so that's kind of our hope of why we're doing this today.
Sure. So I'm going to bring a directive to the call here. And one of the things that I would just preface this with is that this is an example of something you might use in the context of a creative arts therapies session or something like that. But in order to practice those things, that there is a scope of practice around that. And so, for example, in New York State, you have to be licensed in order to practice in that way. And it varies state to state. So if that's something, if anyone's watching this who is a mental health practitioner and curious about this method of practice, you would want to do a little bit more research into what the requirements and the scope of practice is around that. So I just kind of have to add that at the beginning. So what I would like us to do, just to give you an overview of what we're going to go through, is to kind of call to mind a question that we might have or be circling around in terms of love and relationships, because that's the topic we're exploring here in this series. And to just kind of hold that question sort of gently in your mind and in your awareness. And I'm going to have us start by, you will need a piece of paper and drawing utensils. Do you have that, Kyle?
I do. And before we dive in, it might be really helpful too to kind of talk even a little bit more about your psychospiritual approach.
So yes. So what I'm sharing here isn't technically, it could be, it just depends on how you experience it. But this is a directive and approach that is used in clinical settings. It's not necessarily qualitatively psychospiritual unless that's how you experience it. But basically, I believe that we all have an essence of self, an inner being. Some might refer to it as your higher self or your soul. If we look at psychological vernacular, they might refer to it as the unconscious self, or someone might refer to it as the inner child. Or if we're looking at it in the frame of Jungian psychology, maybe we're talking about this in terms of archetypes. But basically the idea that there is an aspect of you that is by very nature unknowable to you in its entirety. And so that this unknowable aspect of ourselves is something that compels us. It's something that motivates us and, or even inspires us. And usually when we are on this trajectory, particularly in love and romantic relationships, a lot of our learning, I believe, and learning, I believe, is facilitated by contrast, but we might call that conflict. But it's facilitated by the friction we feel when we butt up against something that we don't understand, doesn't fit the picture of what we think it should be, and or forces us to look at what responsibility we're taking for our own lives as opposed to relying on our external conditions. So I think of that as conflict, contrast, I think is a better term for it. Because when we use the word conflict, we think bad or good, and that's an erroneous split. So when we experience contrast in our lives, we are inevitably propelled forward. There's meaning, there's lessons being learned. There are things information we are gathering about ourselves. And we're also becoming increasingly aware of our boundaries. Every time you butt up against something, you're like, oh, there's an edge I didn't know I had, right? Now, so a lot of learning up until a certain point, in many ways, is catalyzed by pain, by what feels like suffering, what feels like difficulty. And then it's almost like you're trying to plug the holes in your boat, right? But then I think there's a point at which we reach where the holes in our boat are plugged. And now we have to decide, is the growth that I want to experience going to come from pain or suffering, or I'm going to call it, say, egoic attachment, which I talked about in the last video, to the way we think something should be? Or can we now source that from a place of inspiration, from curiosity, from creativity? And what we're going to talk about and explore a little bit today is a bit of a process by which you can start to source that essence of being as a place of inspiration, as a place of creativity, starting to utilize tools that are going to allow you to create meaning, to affect change, to continue to what I call fill up your circumference from a place that is metaphorical, that is playful, that can be childlike, and that can be pleasurable. I don't know if that answers your question.
Give a lot of detail behind what we're doing. So, yeah.
Yes. So just to give an overview, we're going to think about a question that is something that may be prominent in our lives right now around relationships. And we are going to use what's called a squiggle drawing, which was first introduced by Winnicott, who's an object relations theorist. But we're going to combine it with bilateral drawings, which are something that has been used in research studies done with art therapy and EMDR protocols. And then we're going to take that into the body through kind of a guided journey, guided meditation, ask a question, remain open to the essence of you, offering a response. You could say your unconscious self, your inner child parts, whatever you want to think of it, however you want to think of it. And then we're going to use the dominant and the non-dominant hand as a way to interpret what's coming through. Sound good?
Sounds good. And I think this is also helpful. This is my first time doing this too. So I'm going on a journey with the listeners as well.
Mm.
So yeah,
all right.
Let's do it.
Okay. So I would have you hold that question. You might even write it down, and I'm going to do it along with us as well. And for those of you that are participating at this time, I would have you write down, what's your question? What's your big question around relationships right now? I know that I have one. So once you have the question identified, then I would invite you on the same page or on the other side of the page to just create a circle. Doesn't have to be a perfect circle, but just a plain old circle on the page. And then I would have you take a drawing utensil. Doesn't have to be fancy. It could be pen, pencil, as long as you have two, if you have two. I'm going to use pastels. These are oil pastels just because they're colorful and I happen to have them right next to me. And you can use the same color in both hands, or you can use a different color, one in each hand. I'm going to use a different color in each hand because I like to see the track of my right and my left. And so I would have you take one in each hand. And then inside the circle, just allow your hands to start to move and scribble around. And you may need to find something to hold the page down for you. But have you cross the midline as you do so? So one of the things you want to try to do as you're scribbling is make sure that both your right and your left cross the midline of your body at least some of the time as you're doing this. And this is where we start talking about the bilateral stimulation. So as they are crossing the midline and both hands are working, you are activating both sides of your brain. And the idea is that oftentimes we get stuck into rigid patterns of relating and thinking and behaving and perceiving the world because we may be activating, one part of our brain more than another. And typically, for most people, we hang out in our left brain a lot more than we do the right. And the right brain is actually where most of our affectual experiences are stored, and our emotional, expressive part of ourself is stored. And so if we can access some of that, then, that's going to open up the creative expression and emotional expression. Equally, if you are someone who, let's say, is left-handed and tends to hang out more so in your right brain, activating the left side of your brain may allow you some structure in a sense that you may feel like you need. Okay, so you can do that until it feels comfortable to stop, and it's not going to look like anything, and you got to let go of needing it to look like anything. So it's just going to look like a scribble. Okay. And so then in the scribble, I would have you identify some kind of shape and or symbol. And it's kind of like looking at the clouds, looking for shapes in the clouds. So I'd have you take a look at it, identify some shape and or symbol, and then to use your utensil to kind of flesh that out, to make it pop from inside the scribble. Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So I also found a shape inside my scribble. I might ask what came through for you, Kyle?
It kind of looks like a tiny bird getting fed.
Can we see?
It's not a very good representation, but I tried to stand out. Yeah.
Okay. So this is, it's funny because I felt like I got an image of a mother holding a baby.
Ah, I like that.
So there's a couple of directions we could take with this. And we can either go in just at that point. Another thing we could do is we could dialogue with the image itself right now as it is. I think for today's activity, we'll go in first and then we'll dialogue. So what I would have you do is to just kind of take a look at the image, just sort of let it sink into you for a moment. Maybe take a deep breath. And then I'm going to have us go in and do a guided visualization. Okay. So I'm going to invite you to just find that comfortable spot. And when it feels comfortable, close your eyes. Noticing the breath, the way the oxygen fills your lungs and the way you are releasing it without any need to change it. We're just going to be witnessing the inner space for this exercise. And I invite you to call all of your energy home, like ribbons slipping your energy out of any worries or entanglements outside of this present moment. Just calling it home and letting it become concentrated in your body. And as you do so, just becoming aware of your body becoming a little bit heavier, melting into the chair that supports you. Noticing the contact between your feet and the floor. You might even imagine sending roots down from the bottoms of your feet through the floorboards of your home, down through the foundation of the house, down into the layers of rock and crust and soil of the earth. Really grounding you and tethering you to the earth and in this moment. And you might also notice yourself surrounded by a shield or a protective bubble. It's almost like a semi-permeable membrane, which represents your boundaries, your circumference, and this keeps you safe. And you are in complete command of it. And so from this deeply rooted, grounded, and safe place, I invite you to call into your mind the image that came out of your squiggle drawing. And we're going to draw that into the awareness of your third eye, which is the space between your eyes, center of your brow. And imagine projecting it onto a movie screen. And with the breath, we're going to breathe some vitality into that image, almost like pressing play. We're going to give it some movement, some personality, some vitality and animation. And for a moment, you might just regard how it responds. And then I would invite you to allow it to step off the screen or to float off the screen. And allow it to go wherever it wants to go in your body. There will be a location. It may be the same place. It may go somewhere else. But there will be somewhere inside your body it wants to go. And just follow it there. And once you arrive at that place, we're going to ask a question. We're going to ask 3 questions. And the first question is, what wisdom or guidance do you have for me at this time? What wisdom or guidance do you have for me at this time? And just allow yourself to receive however the response may come. Could be images, could be intuition, sensation in the body. It could be a memory. Could just be colors. Could just be static. It's all information. And once you have received that information, we're going to ask the second question, which is, what do you need right now? What do you need right now? And again, just receive whatever unfolds for you. And the last question is, how can I give that to you? How can I give that to you? And so I invite you just to breathe in that witnessing, almost as if it is a fragrance. Letting the wisdom really sink in through the lungs into your bloodstream. Just letting that become cell memory, body knowledge. And trusting that in time, through synchronicities in your environment, your own imagination, creativity, intuition, and even your dreams, that the deeper understanding will rise to your conscious awareness. And so I'm going to count backwards from 5 to 1. And with the last number, we can release this practice. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And so without too much processing, I would have you jot down the answers that came to you for your questions. So I can share a little bit of what came through for me, and then maybe give a little demo of how we would extend upon it, and then we can process a little bit. So for me, I'll just show you again. This was my image there. And when I went in, and the question I posed was, what is your guidance? The response I got was open up to connection. And when I asked, what do you need? It was more connection. And when I asked, well, how can I give that to you? The response was more fun and relaxation. And what about for you, Kyle?
My question my initial question was, how can I help others better understand what I need? And this is actually outside of my romantic relationship, but just in more professional relationships. And part of the image I had was like a bird being fed. And so a lot of my history is me doing all the work to find the food, even for other people. And one of the things I've been really challenging myself to do is to delegate and allow other people to fill in and do part of the responsibility. And so this was just a reminder of that with some of the things that I have going on right now in terms of planning a pretty large event and dealing with people who are not a part of my team, but sit on committees that I run, and me trying to figure out how do I help them get on the same page with me so they can take off some of the load so I'm not doing so much management. So, yeah.
That's a good one.
It is, yeah.
I feel like I can take a lesson with that too, in sort of allowing me to have more fun and relax.
And that's what the dancing bird was for me. It was this, I am really pushing my personal limits right now, and there's a longing for self-care and relaxation, and I have that, and I'm making space for that, but there's a need for more, especially during a really stressful time. And so it was a nice little reminder to see kind of that visual in my head of that bird kind of dancing around.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting too, because the solar plexus, like upper abdomen, is associated with like ego identity and productivity. So it's kind of about like how you put yourself out into the world. It's usually associated with your profession and your job and the things that you do. And the lower abdomen is the solar plexus, as the sacral, and it's usually associated with creativity and fluidity and emotion, and also the ability to hold opposites. So that's really interesting. When mine went in, my question was, can partnership and freedom coexist? And what is my block to feeling like they can? Because while I know they can, I don't feel that way all the time. And so when my image went into the body, it actually duplicated, and it's almost like it split off. So there was like two, it went from 1 to 2, and one was in my heart and the other was in my sacral. And I think for me, it connects to an activity like this I did a few weeks ago, which was, I didn't know what my blocks are to partnership. I knew it had to do with freedom, but I wasn't sure exactly what that is. And I realized in that meditation that I felt like I had to have more children if I wanted to have a serious partnership, and I don't want more children. So there was, in that meditation, the message was like, you can let go of that. You can have significant partnership without having to have more children. And I think that ties into my ideas about freedom as well. So it's interesting to me that the image that came up is a mother and child, because it feels like that is something that continues to, a theme for me that continues to play itself out.
Yeah.
So an extension of this would be to do dominant and non-dominant handwriting. So let's say I can take mine. how can I give this to you? More fun and relaxation. So let's say I wanted more elaboration on that. I'm a righty. So with my dominant hand, I might write a question like, how can I facilitate more fun and relaxation? And then this is when you hand it over to your non-dominant hand and you allow your body to respond ideally without monitoring the response too much. So for you, it might be, how can I get these committee members on the same page, right? And then allowing your non-dominant hand to respond. So how can I facilitate more fun and relaxation? So at this point, I kind of just try to turn my brain off and I just let my hand move, which isn't always easy, but it's a practice and you get better at it with time. Okay, so what came through for me was make your assistant help you with activity ideas and put them straight into your schedule, and then trust that the balls in the air won't fall.
Yeah, mine was just demonstrating trust and faith in the other person. Yeah, I get often when running committees, the people who will say, "Oh, well, how do you want this done?" And I try to push back. Well, here's my idea, but what is your thoughts? How would this look if you were to do this, and take complete ownership of it? And with the intensity of this recent project and the timeline, I have done that less because there's been so much stress with it. And when I get stressed out, it's interesting. One of my patterns is to do more instead of doing less. And so this just is a reminder of how to get back into slowing down and relationally allowing others to kind of use their own internal wisdom to direct where we're going to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So I would just ask in general, like, how was this experience for you? Were there any things that you noticed in the whole process? Were there things that stood out to you?
Do you want because there's different parts of my brain that are active right now. There's the clinical part, and then there's just the non-clinical person part.
I think the non-clinical person part is probably more interesting. But we can bring the clinical piece back.
I know. I think so, as not thinking necessarily through the therapeutic lens, but thinking more of just my own personal experience. I think so much of us, or at least growing up, I always had a tough time of kind of letting go and really trusting my own instinct. And I think what this exercise does is it lets you experiment and test that and see, I think there's such a pressure. My therapist years ago, he once said, man is the only animal who runs faster when he is lost. And that was a very accurate representation of how I lived. Since then, that's not my style as much, but it's still an old pattern that I have. And so I feel like this again, being able to slow down to kind of look into my inner world of what are my values, where's the direction, what types of things can I do to move closer towards who I want to become, just internally, without doing a ton of dialogue, without doing a ton of reading or more research. It kind of built some confidence up in me. And I think I'm going to bring in my clinical brain for a moment. From an attachment sense, as someone who's anxious attachment, we might not really trust that inner wisdom, or might not have built that relationship. And I think slowing down and asking ourselves and getting clearer with that part and building that relationship can be really helpful in understanding our values, understanding what is important to us, and then taking actions based on those deeper things that are really important to us.
Yeah. I think that this is a practice that I have started doing. It didn't always work this way, but it was a practice I got into after I had a tremendous shift in catalytic events in my life. So major breakup. I had a miscarriage. 3 immediate family members got really sick. 2 of them with chronic illnesses. And I also lost my job at the same time. So all of these things sort of happened at the same time. And so like my attachment system was inflamed with all kinds of insecure things happening. And that was when I started turning more towards, I'd always been someone who believed in something beyond myself and whatnot. But this was when I really started looking at it much more earnestly. And that was when I decided to become a Reiki practitioner and learned a lot about chakra work and the body. And I had taken some dance therapy courses when I was in college, and that came back as well. So understanding the relationship of the body, learning a lot more about trauma in the body. And so ultimately came to this place where I felt like the body really is a conduit for spirit. And that how we feel is the way that our inner being talks to us. And we associate that with instinct, right? And being able to trust one's instinct as opposed to thinking this is just my reactive attachment, right? So this process that we did today, I do usually at least once a day or once every other day to remain in contact with what I, over time, had to shift and prioritize as being the truth of something. Because I think I have in the past also fallen into the trap of feeling like to figure something out, I had to take the next training, or I had to get the next degree, or I had to this, or I had to that. And that somehow that would eventually give me permission to feel like I understood what was going on, or that would eventually confirm that I had found the answer and now I was going to be happy. And I think that this was a giant shift for me, being able to tap into the inner space. And so that's kind of, sorry.
Yeah, I kind of want to interject because it's, I think there's such a common theme in just as humans that we need more. I need to learn more. I need to read the next books. And there's not only, education is valuable, but there's a point where you lose yourself. And I think sometimes, particularly with anxious attachment style, and even people who feel fundamentally inadequate or other things, they often will use that information as a way to avoid being with themselves. And this exercise, what it does is it's not requiring any information, rather it's allowing you to integrate the information you already have and to use that rather than continuing to hunt for the next thing that you have a fantasy will actually protect you, will make things better, will make it perfect, which often doesn't actually happen. And so this is really, a lot of the people I work with, I really ask them to stop doing so much and actually slow down and get in touch with stuff, because what I found is them reading the next book, reading the next workshop, or watching the next video is they're actually avoiding what's going on inside. They're always working either on their business or on themselves or on their partner, and they're not getting in touch with their emotional intelligence, their body's intelligence, which there's actually a research institute, I think it's called Heart Math, where I believe they proved that intelligence from like the heart, which is emotions, and that was much more powerful or intelligent compared to psychological intelligence. There's something about that. I've heard
that they found like what we think of as neurons or brain cells. They've found them in the heart and in the gut.
Mm-hmm. And they talked about how that is actually more powerful than what we have up here, which is really interesting. And I think what you invited us into today was to get more in touch with our heart and our gut compared to letting our brain run the show. And especially in a culture in America where we're so head heavy, slowing down and getting connected to what's going on in our body and getting answers from within can be really powerful compared to how we've been operating all along.
Sure. So with that, I would invite anyone who was watching our experience today and or had a response to share their responses in the comments below here if they would like to, because Kyle and I are going to be coming back to do some live stream videos to discuss what the response has been to this 4-part video series. And I will just give a little plug before we close that if you are someone who's interested in learning more about attachment styles or learning more about how I work with these things, I'm going to put a link to a quiz in the caption of this video as well. And Kyle, I know there's a few things that you offer as well.
Yeah, so one of the things I offer is what I call the Intimacy 5 Challenge. It's kind of doing this inner work, but with your partner. You're actually slowing down, you're getting intimate emotionally with your partner, and the reason they're called challenges because they are challenging, and they're actually designed to bring up uncomfortable feelings of closeness, of thoughts, of beliefs, of perceptions and expectations that often can block us from being really connected and creating that sacred space between partners. And so if you want to download that, just click on the link below, and you'll get access to that.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle. This has been a great fun for me.
Yeah, it's been a great series.
Yes, and I look forward to joining you again for the live stream Q&As.
Perfect.